Okay, so today we're going to finish off the book of Matthew. We've got last 3 chapters to write about, to read. Matthew 26, 27, 28. The arrest and trial and ordeal and crucifixion of Jesus, followed by his resurrection. This is actually Good Friday of 2024, March 29th. Easter is in 2 days. So I did want to get around to this material during this time period. It's a nice little fitting connection. Doesn't make a difference to anybody listening to this video, of course. It doesn't make a difference to you or to me when I watch this later. But it is nice to finally have some synchronization between the text I'm reading and the time of year that I'm currently in. I tried to time it with Christmas, the birth narratives of Christmas. Couldn't get that done. But anyway, I have a cat. The cats are out right now, so they'll be nuisances, as they always are. Matthew 26. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, when he was done talking about the Olivet Discourse, as we call it, Matthew 24, 25, talking about the upcoming destruction of Jerusalem, the temple in particular, that was the conclusion of the 5th and final block of teaching in the book of Matthew. We've seen this before in the past when Matthew has concluded way back starting after the first block of teaching with the Sermon on the Mount. Hey, Matthew. At the end of chapter 7, he says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, that's the Sermon on the Mount, he came down from the mountain and the crowds were amazed at his teaching. At the beginning of chapter 11, after he sends his apostles out with the instructions, in chapter 11, verse 1, after Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he has another block of teaching in parables in chapter 13. At the chapter 13, verse 53, it says, when Jesus had finished his parables, he moved on from there. Then he has teachings about the humility and the nature of servants in the kingdom. In chapter 18, at the beginning of chapter 19, verse 1, it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee. So now the 5th and final time we're going to see that, because he's just finished his 5th big block of teaching in the book. So 26, verse 1, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Yeah. You are not the Son of Man. You're not even a man. You're not a human being at all. You are an animal. A cat. Yes. Be quiet. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, whose name is Caiaphas. And here's sirens out there. I certainly got the cat's attention. And they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way, like trapping an animal, like setting a snare for an animal to fall into and kill him. But not during the feast, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. Now there is going to be a riot. Or close to a riot. Pilate is going to be afraid that a riot will break out. But it's going to be a riot of people demanding Jesus' crucifixion. I'm not entirely certain. I still don't quite know how they managed to go from cheering his entry into the city, and even here in the middle of the week, apparently, the chief priests were fearful the people would riot if they moved against Jesus during the feast, to like a day or two later chanting. I don't know. We'll talk about that as we get through there. I don't quite know how that switch got flipped, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. This could have happened earlier, though. Just because it's included here at this spot in the text doesn't necessarily mean it happened then. Because I know this because the very next thing that's recorded did not happen at this moment in time. It happened actually before Jesus came into the city, and we know that because John tells us that. So let's read this. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. Now Mark includes this information too, as does John. And John will actually tell us where exactly this was happening. In addition to being in Bethany, the home of a man named Simon the leper, this is also the same house where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. I presume Simon the leper was their father, I presume. Obviously, he's not a leper anymore, because I'm assuming Jesus healed him. If he's assuming he's there, okay, so a leper couldn't live in his own house. He'd have to go live somewhere out with the leper colony, somewhere outside the city. So assuming that he's back in his house, he is no longer afflicted with whatever skin disease he had. Presumably Jesus healed him. And it seems as though he would be the father of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And we know this was their house because John makes that clear. Now, Mark and Matthew don't even mention Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Luke will introduce them, and we'll read more about them in John. But they are not identified by name in Mark or Matthew, which is interesting. And we'll talk more about these characters as we see them officially, get formally introduced to them in Luke and then in John, and kind of deal with the question of why they are mentioned in those Gospels but are not mentioned in Matthew and Mark, probably because Matthew and Mark were written earlier. And there may have been a security risk around Lazarus in particular that prevented them from wanting to disclose details about him or his location. And maybe later on, by the time Luke and especially John got written, he may have already died, and that was no longer as much of a concern. But we'll talk about that more when we officially meet these characters in the later Gospels, because they're not mentioned by name, introduced or identified in Matthew and Mark, unless Mary is also Mary Magdalene, and that character is officially mentioned in both Mark and Matthew. But we'll talk about that later too. At any rate, we know this happened in the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, presumably the offspring of Simon the leper. I guess he could have been still an older brother of Lazarus, but most likely he was the father. And we also know this happened before Jesus came into the city riding on the donkey, or the colt of the donkey, because John will tell us this. He did this happened first, and then he went into the city. In John chapter, was it 11 or 10 or 11? 11, actually the beginning of chapter 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, and there was a dinner served, and then the anointing scene happens. And the next day, he had the great crowd heard that he was on his way to Jerusalem, and that's when they did the entry into the city. So at this point in the story, this anointing scene has already happened. Matthew and Mark include this at the end of this week, like right before, after all the stuff that happened in the temple. But this actually happened before that. It's actually, chronologically, this scene should go before Matthew 21. So anyway, while Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which he poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, and again, John will highlight this specifically as being a problem with Judas Iscariot, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Now again, remember, John will identify Judas as the primary person who was complaining about this. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. I tell you the truth. Wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. And from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Now, this again is probably out of order. We know that the scene before this with the anointing of Jesus by Mary of Bethany, Mary the sister of Martha and Lazarus, is out of order because John tells us precisely when that happened. And John also tells us that the apostle who caused the most ruckus about this was Judas. And so it was a confrontation between Jesus and Judas that resulted from that anointing scene. The way that Mark and Luke link these two things, the anointing and then the agreement of Judas to betray Jesus, indicates that there was something about this confrontation that caused Judas to make up his mind to betray Jesus. Mark 14 and Matthew 26 both put these events right next to each other. And we know from John that the anointing actually happened before he came into Jerusalem. And we also know that Judas was the one primarily complaining about the waste of the expensive perfume, and Jesus was rebuking him in particular, and not just the disciples in general. But now John does not then link that to Judas's motivation to betray Jesus, but both Matthew and Mark include that right after talking about the anointing, even though both Matthew and Mark have the anointing story out of chronological order. So it seems like, putting it all together, it seems like this moment was a breach between Jesus and Judas, and it was after this, after he was rebuked by Jesus, that Judas made up his mind that he was going to betray him. I don't know exactly what Judas was thinking. We're going to find out later that he was sorrowful that Jesus was condemned. Apparently, he was not expecting Jesus to actually be condemned to death. So I don't know exactly what Judas was thinking or what he was trying to accomplish. He may have been motivated purely by money. I don't know. He may have been motivated by a disappointment in Jesus not being the kind of Messiah that he wanted. He may have been he may have been trying to actually force a confrontation between Jesus and the authorities. He may have been thinking that if he got Jesus surrounded and in trouble with the enemy, he would have to act forcefully to claim his throne, and that's what Judas wanted. He may have. I just don't know. None of the Gospels, none of the New Testament goes into his psyche or explains his motivation. Possible that none of them ever knew. It seems that up to this point, it seems as though Judas was completely above all suspicion. And they may never have heard what his motivation was. John will record him leaving the upper room while they're all gathered there for the Last Supper, and then he goes out into the darkness. They see him again briefly in the garden when he leaves the crowd to arrest Jesus. But other than that, they never talked to him again, so it's possible they never knew what he was thinking. It's possible that they never did understand what he was motivated by, so they just didn't include the information because they didn't know. I don't know. Anyway, so this conversation between Judas and Jesus probably happened earlier in the week, because we know the anointing scene happened before he even got into Jerusalem, and we know that Judas was the one who was arguing with Jesus about this, and there seems to have been something of Judas seems to have somewhat snapped or something after that. So probably from the time they entered the city, all throughout that week, he was trying to find an opportunity to talk to the priests and, get away from the others, get off by himself, talk to the priests and find this. So we don't know exactly when or how, but it would have probably been pretty early in that week. Anyway, on the first day I say all this again partially just to remind us that these events aren't always recorded in chronological sequence. And we need to be careful about that. Just because it's mentioned here doesn't mean it happened at this time.